Hey everyone, my name is Michael Seiger and I'm the founder and publisher of iSixSigma.com, the largest community of Lean Six Sigma professionals in the world and the resource for learning to drive breakthrough improvement. Today's show was taped live in Seattle, Washington at the Lean Startup Meetup organized by John Seacrest. I want to thank John for opening up the meetup to iSixSigma and allowing us to record the presentation. Having said that, the video is less than optimal. I promise to take lighting with me for the next recording. The speaker's easel pad is visible throughout, and the audio is of good quality. A written transcript is also available below, so you can read along, read instead, or download the MP3 to your iPod for your commute or workout. Today's speaker is Jim Benson. Jim is the author of Personal Kanban, a simple tool that allows individuals and teams to visualize their workflow, stay informed, and get more work accomplished. Kanban can be applied to software development teams, as is evidenced by the questions during the presentation. However, Kanban can also be applied in almost any other area, including your personal work and your personal life. If you have questions, please post them in the comments below, and I'll invite Jim back for a follow-on interview where I deep dive into all of your questions. Here's your program.
Hi there, everybody. Why are you guys hiding behind the pillar? Why don't you come back out here and hang out with us a bit? As you can see, I have no computer. I have no slide deck. You will see no slides tonight. I think PowerPoint should be eradicated from the face of the planet. It's so easy. So I'm Jim Benson. I'm the CEO of a company called Modus Cooperandi, and we do collaborative management. One of the major tools that we use is a Kanban. Several years ago, we did our first Kanban project when I had my software development company. That was 2006, 2005, and noticed almost immediately that Kanban made an extreme difference in the way that teams operated. It raised the level of clarity, the level of awareness, the level of conversation, gave rise to continuous improvement, made that continuous improvement real time, and completely changed all of the rules to the agile processes that we were doing before. So I'll rewind a little bit. I went to university and studied psychology, and then one day looked around at the people in my department and said, man, if I become a psychologist, these guys are going to be my peers. So I figured I had to do something else right away, and I got a degree instead in urban planning. And so for about a decade, I ran around and built light rail systems and bridges and freeways and did things like replan 405 6 maddeningly times. So I've managed projects of billions of dollars with thousands of people involved. So then I opened a software company and everybody's like, software development's hard. We've got big teams and it's so hard. And I'm like, seriously? And our budgets are really gigantic or they're really small. So it was really kind of screwed with my mind. I was like, you've got 8 people on your team. It's not a big thing. So when we started our software development company, our clients were government agencies, and we were selling Agile to government. And we were very successful. So the company ran for 9 years until we got sick of it, and we went off to do other things. And for me, it was very easy to sell Agile to government, even though it was very, very foreign to them, because we could speak their language in essence. So we could run that translation between what our teams were doing and what they needed to do. And again, in about 2006, we did our first Kanban project, and I was completely blown away by how different it was. The first thing I did was I fired myself as a product owner. So we had no single point of contact between our development team and our client. And then after that, it was just kind of a heyday for breaking all of the Agile rules and finding out that they weren't quite as sacred as they thought they had been over the past 8 years. So, we were talking about Scrum a second ago. If you really want to pull my string, make me talk about Scrum. So, well, step back here and... yes, I'd love to. So I'm going to start here by talking a little bit about what personal Kanban is. Go all. I could, but I need both my hands. So a Kanban, for personal Kanban, we have two rules. It's visualize your work and limit your work in progress. And in the end, what we find is that if you give teams those two very loose rules, they go crazy. They become very productive, but more importantly, they become very effective. They stop doing stupid things. Whereas before, they tend to do a lot of stupid things because we're trying to either use the agile world where we're trying to smash a bunch of stuff into 2 weeks, or the no-holds-barred waterfall techniques where you have 6 months and you try and do 50,000 things in those 6 months. So visualizing your work, initially you have your value stream, which are the steps that you take to create value. And the simplest one possible is ready, doing, and done. Basically, the stuff you haven't done yet, the stuff you're doing, and the stuff that you've completed. I could get a thicker pen, if that makes you happy. That's right.
Try this one.
I would, but these ones don't write very well. Really, they're tough. So at any rate, as my lovely assistant will write right behind me. So what this has done here is this has built a quick story of how we work. And it's a very universal story. All languages, cultures, every song, movie, epic poem is based on this. It's a birth, life, resolution story. So once we start doing things like populating this with our work, whether that's tasks or whether it's user stories or whether it's bugs or features or whatever, however we may be setting those up, doesn't really matter. What does matter is we're talking about stuff that needs to be realized, that excitement of realization and then the completion. For our personal work, right now, every single person in this room has expectations placed upon them. So we have stuff from work, stuff from family, our own personal expectations, stuff from our friends. All that stuff right now is jumbled up in our heads in a very conceptual, amorphous blob. And if we looked at it, it might look something like this. And this is not very manageable. So what we want to do with the Kanban is grab these things. These are the super sticky ones, so sometimes they're hard to get off. And we populate our backlog. And when we're doing this, we're starting to make sense of all of these expectations that are upon us. Let's do one more. And what we've done is we've turned that amorphous blob now into something that's cognitively much more pleasing for us. We've turned this into a rectangle. And while that seems kind of ridiculous, now we can see our work and it's not quite so threatening. One of the most kind of heartwarming emails that Tony Ann and I received. I should say, I've written a book called Personal Kanban with my co-author Tony Ann, who's lurking about somewhere around here. One of the best emails that we received was from a family who is a very strong patriarchal family. They totally love their dad, and it looks kind of like this if it's held by Michael. They suddenly found out that their father had stage 4 cancer. And this guy was like the glue of the family. And so the family was like, well, we don't know what we're going to do. And they were completely ineffective at doing anything. So they set up a Kanban just to manage his treatment. And after they got the treatment up, they're like, oh, this is just a bunch of stuff to do. It's stressful and it sucks. but it's just a bunch of stuff to do, and now we can focus on helping our dad and making him feel better and healthier and get through all of this. So this goes back to a concept that we call existential overhead. And existential overhead is, all of the fears, all of the pain that you have that's following you around right now, and that lowers your capacity for work. So just like in normal Kanban, where we'll set a WIP limit here for the team, and saying like the team can only be working on 3 user stories at a time, we also in personal Kanban set a WIP limit. And that WIP limit is directly relates to how much work you can actually do right now. And if you have a large amount of existential overhead, the amount of work that you can do decreases. And a lot of the existential overhead that we give ourselves, move that up like that, is work in progress. So if we're doing 6, 7, 8, 9 things at once, or we have 6 or 7, 8 or 9 things that we haven't completed, we never stop thinking about them. So it's something that's called the Zeigarnik effect. And the Zeigarnik effect says if you finish a task, you tend to kind of forget about it. And if you don't finish a task, you never forget about it. So if you have 25 things that you've not finished or haven't reached some resolution on, they're going to bug you at night. I'm not done with that, I'm not done with that, I'm not done with that. So it's hard to get to my Kanban here. So we'll just we'll move up here to flow. And what we would like to achieve in this Kanban is an understanding of how our work flows, or how it can float gracefully to the ground. So right now, there are 3 things in our doing column, and we have this WIP limit of 3. We finish one, and then we can pull another one. And so this is a pull-based system. So Scrum is kind of a hybrid pull-push-based system. So what we've done here is we have pulled this because we have capacity for it. In Scrum or in Agile, what we do is we say, we have defined this 2-week period, and we believe we have this much capacity, so we're going to pull this much work. But in reality, what we've done is we've pushed work onto ourselves. So what we want is to understand what the cadence is of our work, and then that starts to tell us some things almost immediately. So if things flow through here, and they flow through at a fairly regular rate, and then this one gets stuck here for a couple of weeks, where things usually take a couple of days, then we understand that there must be something the matter with this. So that's like the quick version of flow there. We talked about pull, so we'll move up to clarity. So what we found when we started working with Kanban was that teams suddenly had a greater clarity over not only what they were doing, but what their peers were doing. And this is in real time. So before, when we asked a team what's going on, they say, well, we're in this sprint and we have these user stories and we know that they're being worked on or that they're going to be worked on. What happened with this transition was people said, this is exactly what's happening right now, this is exactly the state of completion, and this is exactly what's done. The upshot of that was that, or is, that you can make more decisions in real time. So you have at the beginning of the, you have these things prioritized in this like that. And so this is the one of highest priority, but you get to the end of the day and you know that you can do this in an hour. You know, you pull that, you get it done in an hour, and you go home and try and leave that open. So I wanted to go through that pretty quick tonight because I wanted to talk more about the lean startup aesthetic and how this relates to what is talked about in, come on, just stick to something, to the lean startup books. And one of the things that we've discussed quite a bit in the last few years is what the role of failure is in an organization. And we want to fail fast. We want to have pivot points. We want to make course corrections along the way so that we can avoid a lack of success. And that does not mean that if we do the lean startup methodology that we will be successful, because businesses fail statistically. So that's something to keep in mind. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. When we're working with a Kanban, or when we're working with a visual control, one of the things that we are blessed with is this understanding of this is what we've completed, this is what's coming up, and we can start to set experiments up that are real-time and extremely provable, which is pretty vague, I know. But what we do here is, as work is flowing through, we have what we call cycle time. And the cycle time is the amount of time it takes to pull something out of here and complete it. And when we start to understand that, then we start to understand what our rate of completion is. And one of the things that I found in working with now a lot of different software projects is the distribution of tasks or the distribution of stories is usually fairly consistent. So we spend a lot of time in planning meetings saying, is this a 3-point story or a 5-point story? And I know that we're not supposed to, but we end up spending a lot of time doing that. But in the end, it doesn't really matter because it all balances out. So what we do instead, or what the teams that I've been working with do instead, is we'll do regular releases, 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever, or real-time releases, depending on what the industry is. And whatever makes it into that is what gets released. And here's, I can go 5 different ways with that. So one other thing I'll say is, if you guys have questions, ask questions as soon as you have a question. Yes, Ken, I believe you have a question.
I still have no concept of what the difference is between the way that I execute Scrum and what you're doing with this.
Do you have whip limits in Scrum?
Sorry?
Do you have whip limits in Scrum?
I don't know what a whip limit is in particular, but we have the ability to work on one thing at a time each. And so if there's 6 of us and we're working on 6 different things, then we work on 6 different things till they're done. Okay. So there's a very discrete limit on things. As far as when you talked about the sprint, mm-hmm. I think that the way you talked about it seems to me that there are people who have tried to impose these waterfall expectations into what Agile brought to Scrum. Yep. But I don't think but I think that that's more of an implementation problem. The way that we have always been doing this, since 2000 I've been doing this, and if we just say we're going to work on this for 2 weeks and we expect we're going to get this done, but we don't know. Mm-hmm. And so we get done what we get done. So other than this being the breaking it down into the Kanban board, breaking it down in a slightly different way between the backlog, what we're actually working on at the moment, and what we've completed, I don't understand any real functional differences between the two. Okay. I was hoping that maybe as you talk, you could be more clear about why this is different. Okay.
Did everybody hear that? Good. Okay, so... Could you repeat the question? Yeah. The question was what? So there's a couple of things that I'll try and cover very quickly. Number one is, yes, the way you're describing it is the way it's supposed to work, and works that way very, very, very rarely. So. In an interview, Ken Schwaber said that 75% of all Scrum implementations fail because people aren't doing it right. When I hear that, I don't think there's a problem with the people. So,
but what, so again, one of the questions is, how is this going to make people smarter? Because again,
Okay.
I don't think that it's that hard. I think the problem is that people had a mindset, they have that
Okay.
mindset, and they'll have that mindset.
Who are the people?
So, the people in management in general like the concept of saying, I'm going to get this feature on this date. That makes them warm and fuzzy inside. So whatever system you have, they're going to try to force it into a way that it tells them, I'm going to have this feature on this date.
Okay.
Agile was never designed to do that.
Okay.
It was designed to tell them, you're probably going to have this feature around this date. But now they've tried. So what's the difference between 5 years from now or 8 years from now when people have forced, the same people have forced the same thing onto Kanban?
Okay. So there's like 5 conversations there. So the first thing is the devolution of any management idea. Okay? The reason that we go through different phases of management or different management fads is not because the previous ones were flawed. It was because we as human beings will fuck things up over time. Tony Ann and I had a client that had 5 different teams, and the teams were mandated they would all do 100 points per iteration. It was completely ludicrous, and of course they did. They were always very successful at getting that done because it was complete garbage numbers. Having said that, management is necessary. And so what this has told me is that story points and iterations have not been entirely successful at being a communication mechanism between coders or coding teams and the rest of the organization or their clients or whomever they're working with. So with Kanban, what we wanted to do was put up a board that says, dude, this is what we're working on. This is what we've done. This is what's coming up. Do you ever have a problem with that? Because we're going to show you this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not only that, but if you come down and tell us that we need to do more, we already know that this is our optimal processing capacity as a group. This is our speed limit, and if you go above, you're going to have either a breakdown in quality or a breakdown in time or in cost. And so the WIP limit is a fairly explicit elucidation of what the team can do in a high quality way.
Say what WIP is.
WIP is work in progress. Sorry about that. So we want to limit our work in progress as individuals and as groups. We want to limit it to a point to where we are comfortable completing that work. And there's a couple of interesting charts that I can't flip this. So there you go. It is sticky. I can run back and forth with this and re-stick it repeatedly. This is a deadline matrix. So here we have errors. And here we have, here's your deadline. So this is time to deadline. Don't care what the deadline is. This is how that curve looks. So what happens is as we get closer to our arbitrary deadline, if that arbitrary deadline is anything other than what we can actually complete in that amount of time, as we get closer, we get more and more stressed. And this is basically our technical debt generation unit. Now, in Agile, the original goal was we were going to say, we believe that over the next 2 weeks or over the next iteration, we are going to be able to complete this much stuff. And then if you didn't, you'd say, crap, I hope I can do it next time. But, as Ken pointed out, the people that we work with don't speak that language. So with the Kanban, we wanted to remove that language altogether. And to say, we understand that we have this cycle time down here, and this cycle time we've generated by, I really didn't think I was going to go all technical tonight, by plotting out the completion times of the stuff that we've done over the last couple of weeks, or the last year, or whatever that might be. And
that's yellow.
that is yellow. It's gorgeous. You guys are tough. So over time, what we can do is we can get a composite cycle time number that we can actually start to offer an SLA or an SLA-like thing to the people who we're working for. Because we know that 85% of the stuff is going to be done, if not at this point, significantly before this point. Most of the stuff that we do that doesn't make that point is just outside this line, and you can have a quick conversation and say, you know what, we thought it was going to take 2 weeks, but it's going to take 2 weeks and 2 days. Sorry. Then, the farther you get out here, you're like, do you still want to complete this, or this is insane? And what we've also found is that if you give a group of coders a bunch of stuff, and you say, give me story points on a Fibonacci curve from whatever to whatever, they will do it. But if you also give them that same bunch of user stories and you say, tell me which ones of these are stupid, they'll do that too. And the second one is actually more valid than the first one. Because the ones that aren't stupid will fit into this area. So rather than starting a 2-week sprint and using the horrible word of commitment, we can actually now say, over the next 2 weeks, we're reasonably sure that we're going to get this stuff done. And since we're not committing to a group of features, we can pull anything out of this backlog that we want over the 2 weeks, and it will hopefully make sense. One of the other things that happens is, let's take this one off, and let's say you're sitting here and you've got 3 things in WIP, and all of a sudden, your load balancer explodes. You're not going to say, oh, you know what, I got 3 things in WIP, you got to wait for my load balancer. I'll fix the load balancer next week. I hope that the 65 million hits that we were going to get aren't too upset. But no, you can put it in here and fix it, and no one dies, right? There is no whip police that comes in and says, dude, I'm going to totally kick you around for going past your whip. So what we want out of this is to be able to exercise our professional judgment at any given point in time about what's the important stuff to be doing. So we want our teams to be able to truly self-organize, to use the Agile term, not only in their composition of who's on the team, but also in their composition of what work is being done at any given point in time.
There you go. Oh, sorry. This technique applies perfectly fine when somebody totally understands how a massive delivery is broken down into tasks and who's doing what. And so typically working on engineering projects that are quite big, you need some sort of a, what should I say? I see my tasks becoming more fine-grained when I'm saying, oh, okay, this is not looking like a 1-week business. I got to spend more than 2 weeks on this.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that the moment I look at that board, what I visualize is a lot of rejiggering as I get more clarity, as the team gets more clarity. Does it allow for that? Is it malleable enough to to support that. Because all said and done, if every project is a nice breakdown of tasks, oh, kosher, we can go ahead and execute that. But when a big requirement comes in, the process of task breakdown itself makes sense only when you're in the whip stage.
Right. And
so, I mean, can you juggle things around?
Okay.
Is it malleable enough?
Okay. I'm really enjoying the fact that people who are asking questions are loud enough to hear. And did you guys in back hear that? Awesome. This is cool. Okay, so the whole point of this is to make a system that is A, fault tolerant, and B, eminently flexible. So, number one, I don't care what anybody puts on their tickets. And so I see boards all the time where people will set up, they'll say, we're going to work on one epic at a time. And they put that epic in, and it sits up here in a column, and then it explodes into a bunch of stories. And then they'll actually have those stories explode into a bunch of tasks that may be pulled by any member of the team. And in the middle of that, should something explode or should something become more important, you can find ways to move that through your stream if it's really that important. So one of the things that this is not doing is expecting that people will have to decompose those tasks up front. So I have here 3 stories of 3 start. Yes.
We'll get the questions cleared out.
Okay.
So one of the things you were talking about is that things tend to get done toward the end of an iteration. So I can imagine positive and negative effects that happen in an organization based on eliminating that sort of productivity curve from the measured perspective. Can you talk about what the effects are on an organization?
Oh, absolutely. So did everybody get that, or should I repeat that one? So the question there is, can I talk a little bit about the positive and negative impacts of when we get to the end of a deadline and then the removal of that impediment. So one of the big shocks for me as someone who had come from government and then from software development, was that when you removed the threat of deadlines, people actually did more. It completely freaked me out. And to the point that I didn't believe it for several years. I just kept gathering data. So it just keeps working. And so what I figured out happened was that bring this back. That's really dirty though. When people see their work in the visual control, it has a really interesting psychological impact on the team. The teams, like I said before, they see the story of their work, they see the flow of their work, and they start gaming that system. And here because this is actually kind of fun. And I'm hoping it's illustrative. So let's say that we have this backlog, and hopefully it's set up a little bit better than this. And we have a software development team. And that software development team is made up of people. And those people are human beings, and they all fall somewhere between these 2 dots. And this dot is the ADHD dot, and this dot is the Asperger's dot. And that dot is the hapless project manager dot. So we have our team that's made up of this people, and are actually probably more like this and like this. Because while I go around telling software developers that they're really not all that special, we really do tend to be kind of special. And so what ends up happening is we have our Kanban here, and our awesome ADHD coder who can take any weird problem and solve it in like 5 minutes. He has 3 things in WIP. And they come by a couple days later, And after, he's like this, and after a while you're like, dude, 3. Seriously. So, so he's like, okay, and so, what he's done is he's done this much of each of these tasks, right? And what are those dots? Those dots are the cool stuff, right? And the rest of this is not done. So you say, you got to finish that, and he's like, that pisses me off. So he really quickly starts finishing things. And it goes over here. And a couple of days later, Adam Urett and the other testers show up at his desk, and they're like, dude, I don't think so. And what does this become? This has become rework. The only thing worse than doing the stuff outside this circle to an ADHD person is to do rework. Rework is just like, I hate it. So then they really game the system and they say, you know what? I'm going to do the least amount that I need to finish these tickets. And make sure that they don't come back. Because I don't want to do any rework. So what's happened is these guys have optimized for how they view the world and how they want to do their work. They've turned this into a game, and they've just written the best code possible. Because our job as coders isn't to write code, it's not to write code. So we've taken this, allowed the gaming of the system, allowed the system to break, and then allowed the system to self-heal. So that's awesome. But then, so what happens next? So next we have our Asperger buddy, and she's pulled a ticket, and it's sitting there on her Kanban. And we come back the next day, and it's sitting there on the Kanban. Then we come back the next Monday, and it's sitting on the Kanban. Then we go on like maternity leave, and we come back, and it's sitting on the Kanban. And so after a while, are you going to finish this? And they're like, it's not perfect yet. Like, well, when's it going to be perfect? Well, when it's perfect. Well, human beings can't know perfection. Buddha says so. So now we say, you know what? You're pulling the rest of the team down. Our goal is to finish this stuff. So now all of a sudden, perfect has a definition. Perfect is how quickly can you write this code so that it goes over here and it doesn't come back. So we've taken the completely disparate worldviews of our team, and we've suddenly given focus, and we've done something that we were never really able to do in Agile, which was we've now defined done. And we didn't have to do it with statistics or measurements or anything. We're using our own professional judgment as software developers and as entrepreneurs. This is done when it goes over here and it doesn't come back. This is fun. And I've watched team after team who have been at each other's throats, and after just a couple of days of fiddling around with this thing, they start having fun. And then they start doing things like team member A pulls that over, and team member B says, oh, hey, I see you pulled that task or that story. I did something like that last week. If you Google this stuff, it's going to save you like 4 hours worth of work. That's just common human courtesy. That's what we do naturally. But if we don't have the visualization, if we don't know the other person's doing that stuff, we can't help them. So being able to allow the team to see what the team is doing creates natural opportunities for collaboration, which creates huge opportunities for cost, time savings, and increases in quality. So, did that answer your question?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we followed Agile and Scrum, and it's just that we use the Grasshopper tool in Jira to do our task breakdown and monitor, but I think we tried Kanban a while ago in our team, and it works like a charm. It brings out everybody can see. To me, the specific problem was that it doesn't enable much in terms of task breakdown per se. It happens organically over a period of time.
Right.
And then, but the clarity of thought in terms of others helping you out and sharing back while actually doing, looking at the board is invaluable.
So, yes.
So I'd sort of like to refactor his question a little bit and do something specific.
Okay.
He's talking about big, hairy ass problem, not very well defined, and gets into works in progress. Then what actually happens to the board when I go, oh shit, this is a 5-week problem and I need to make it into small pieces?
Right. Okay. So there's a couple things with that. So which one to go for first? So we'll go ahead and rip some more paper off of here. Do this again. And by the way, your value stream can be anything you want it to be. Don't think that this is the be-all, end-all of value streams. The other day, one of the teams that I was working with said to me, we miss having planning meetings. And I said, why did you stop doing planning meetings? And they said, because we're doing Kanban. And I was like, no, and that's the funny thing about it was that's what people used to say when we were doing Agile. We don't do planning anymore because we're Agile. It's like, no, that doesn't work either. So we did our first planning meeting using a Kanban. And we do this also every Wednesday morning at Cacao Coffee, which is just around the corner here on Westlake, 415 Westlake. We do a thing called Lean Coffee, and what happens is we get everybody into a room, we set them down at the table, everybody gets Post-it notes, they write down whatever it is that they want to talk about. We introduce the topics on the cards, everybody gets 2 votes, you vote on the tickets what you'd like to talk about, and all of a sudden you have a prioritized list of things to talk about. This works incredibly well for planning meetings and retrospectives. What I found in the retrospectives in a lot of teams were the teams were always looking for somebody to lead the retrospective. And the moment you do something like this, there is no leader other than the team, because the team is creating the backlog of conversation. And when you step away from an agenda-based meeting and into an open, collaborative meeting, you start to see the same benefits that I was talking about from actually using Kanban with the team. So when you get into a decomposition issue, or you get into an issue where it's like this explodes, you need to do a couple of things. One, make a determination about how, what the damage is, and then figure out who needs to be alerted to this situation. So if it's a startup and there's only 6 of you in the room, you all have decision-making authority and you can just, go with it. If you're, part of NBC Universal, you might actually have to, give somebody a bit of an alarm. So what we do in this team, since this is a conversation, we only talk about one thing at a time. The teams will, so we'll say that this, was something that was, had a lot of dot votes. We'll discuss these things in order basically until we run out of time. And if we run out of time and there's things that people feel absolutely they had to talk about, we will continue the meeting. But we really don't go any deeper than this. Because the team at this point can say, okay, what are the issues that we're having? Well, there's a technical issue where we're not able to, X, Y, Z, the ABC. You say, okay, well, then, what are the ramifications of that? But opening that up to a conversation and not to an apology, or to a mea culpa, or to yes, yeah. And the other thing is that when you bring in management, because management should be involved in things like this, then they or we, as the case may be, then everyone gets to see the professionalism of the team and what needs to be discussed. What I've seen is that when things like that happen, and a team has already gone through and said these are acceptable stories and these are not acceptable stories, when that thing explodes, it's usually such an exception that you're able to discuss that exception. So now I'll actually talk about some cognitive biases and the things that were in the rest of my event here. So I worked basically I worked with a ton of different startups, but my first startup was a company called InfoMove. It was over on the east side. Was anybody here in the late 90s and heard of InfoMove by any chance? Awesome. I'm sorry. I hope you weren't working there with me. There's a couple of things about InfoMove. Number one is InfoMove got a ton of money up front. So when I went to work there, we had about 40 employees. 40 employees. And we were building an in-vehicle computing platform in 1999. And you would have your Palm Pilot, and you put it in a cradle, and you could give it these voice commands, and it would do all these great things for you. And so the goal of this was that we could get in, hit the button, and say, Wonder Machine, I would like you to find the nearest Barnes & Noble with a Starbucks, and I would like to get there with a minimal amount of traffic. Thank you very much. And this is 1999. And we were working on Palm Pilots. And so none of us were ever actually allowed to see the system. And so we're going to all these architecture meetings and all these other meetings, and we're doing all of this work and stuff, and it's apparently being folded up into some end system. And we're going to launch at Christmas. And it's the first or second week of, that's the second week of December, and we're going to have an unveiling, an internal unveiling, and all of us have like polished the part of our car that we're going to mount the system in and stuff, and it's going to be awesome. And so we go in, and I walk up to the system, and I say, show me traffic on I-5. And it doesn't do anything. And then I said, why isn't it doing anything? He said, well, it's keyed to his voice. So his walks up and he says, up, right, select. Then he hits the reset button. I about lose my mind. Not only does it not parse sentences, it can't even navigate a menu. And the funny thing about it is anybody with half a brain in 1999 would know that speech recognition technology did not exist at all to handle that type of stuff, let alone work out of a Palm Pilot. So we were suffering from something called the availability cascade. And this is huge in startups. Is you get in and you start to discuss what your dreams are, and you discuss them so much that you think that they've already happened. And so my colleagues were being laid off after a point, like the next week, because we didn't get our next funding. So at that point we were 105 people. So when I went there we were 40, at that point we were 105. When I left we had about 60 people. I was there 5 weeks. We swelled up that much to please Credit Suisse, and then Credit Suisse said, you guys really don't have a product. So they weren't suffering from the availability cascade, and then we laid everybody off. And it was a horrible experience. So we're in the process of writing another book called Scrumban 2 to follow up our Scrumban book from a couple of years ago. And these are companies that have kind of, Scrumban, the book about Scrumban was all about continuous improvement. How to migrate your processes from something that isn't working for you to something that is working for you. And one of our teams, which I can't name yet because they told me I can't yet. So I called them X77B. They also got tons of money. And they staffed way up, and then they got all of these offshore teams in India, and they blasted forward, and 2 years later they had produced absolutely nothing. And during the last year of those 2 years, they spent the whole time fighting about what their processes should be. You know, we're not doing Scrum right, we're not doing this right, we're not doing that right, and they're just fighting back and forth. So then they went back for the next round of funding, and much like InfoMove, the VC said, dude, you didn't do anything. So they laid off everybody but 20 people, and 6 months later they had a working system. So there were two issues there. One is what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy, and the other one is called status quo bias. So both of these biases interacted with these teams in horrible ways. So they basically said, we have all of this work to do and we're not getting it done. The last thing that we should do is let people go. The last thing that we should do is radically alter our processes. But when their system was radically altered for them, all of a sudden they were able to create a system that actually worked for them. The second thing was the sunk cost fallacy. They'd sent everybody out for specific training, and they wanted to use the processes that people had been trained on, and they weren't saying, you know, what are our individual needs, what are our contexts, how do these things work for us? So the third startup was my software development company. We got no money from anybody. We were entirely self-funded, and before that we were civil engineers. So it's not like we came in with a huge war chest. Because, believe me, civil engineers don't get paid very much money. So we needed to set up systems that would allow us to do a whole lot of work with very few people. And that's when we really got into the planning over plans. And constantly, to use your word, rejiggering our backlog so that we knew that we were always providing the best stuff at the best time. We fell into all of these traps all the time. But we never stopped talking to each other. And we also just happened to be the nice word for it would be introspective, but the other thing was just that we're all really bitchy. So we wouldn't allow anybody to ever kind of rest as far as process improvement went. So my first company had no clarity. The second one had some clarity, but it wasn't well distributed. And then our company had, fortunately for us, a great deal of clarity. And one of the things that I figured out is that I think that money and clarity are like they're like butter. And so if you're making a butter sauce or you're making something baked, you add butter into your mix fairly slowly while you're cooking. You don't just dump it all in. If you dump a whole bunch of that stuff in to begin with, it ends up clumping up and destroying what you're doing. And that's also true for our backlogs. So when we talk about minimum viable product, or minimal marketable features, or minimum everything else's, because I think that we've pretty much loaded the word with minimum thingamabobs. When we're talking about that, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to introduce work into this backlog in a way that doesn't overload or overwhelm our doing column. So we've all had projects where we've had literally thousands of functional requirements or user stories or whatever, and they're all loaded up in Jira or Rally or whatever. When we take a look at that long list of stuff, it is not exciting. It is demoralizing, because you just see all this stuff that you've got to do. There's no context to it, it's not functionally derived in any way. What we want to do with this is keep this list to a level where we have a really good idea what these are and why they're there. And if we don't, we either have to get rid of them or we have to have a conversation about them. I'm going to talk about one more cognitive bias really quickly here. That one's called the planning fallacy. And it's one of the most important ones, especially for startups. Every business plan is a planning fallacy playhouse. And the planning fallacy basically says that we can't estimate at all. We're just really, really, really bad at it. And except for you, and because you're superhuman, and that's and that's why you own North America. The planning fallacy goes on to say that we actually are worse when we're planning for other people. So if we do an estimate for other people, we'll always underestimate the amount of time that it takes to do something. But there's good news, because we're even worse at estimating for ourselves. And the worst of all possible scenarios is if you estimate for yourself with witnesses. So if you ever want like your plumber to give you a really good deal, don't get the estimate over the phone. Have them stand in front of you and then guarantee the estimate. And the reason, and this seems to be of all of the cognitive biases. If you go on to Wikipedia, there's 117 cognitive biases, which is scary because it basically means that we are really kind of fallible bags of walking meat. And one of the things that we would like to do with the Kanban, by measuring cycle time and lead time, is truly understand the rate at which we're doing work, and then try and remove us as much as possible from the estimation game. And I could show you all sorts of charts and graphs about that if you want, but I don't think you really want to see them. Although there's one that's really funny, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. And we'll do it over here. So I had this team, and I was suggesting to them that they might want to look more at their cycle time than at their story points. And so they said, we're almost perfect with our story points. And I thought that was amusing. So I said, do you have numbers around that? And they said, yes, we've been charting them. And I said, oh my God. And so they brought these charts out about how their story points related to their actual completion rates. And, let's, so they have their numbers here, and then they would look like, 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour, 3 hours, 7 hours, 3 hours, 3 hours, 3 hours. And yes, everybody that you ask, we all know that we're not supposed to relate these to completion times. I love it. Everybody, even everybody that comes into contact with this will always lower it to completion times, even though we all know we're not supposed to. So it looked like this, and then like this, and like this. And they said, if only we could get rid of these tall ones, we'd be perfect. And that made me laugh. And I said, these were people that worked for a financial services firm, and I said, if you could get rid of these tall ones, you're on the wrong floor. You don't want to be in IT, you want to be trading, because you have now been able to predict the future. But what I see here is beauty. I see the exact same curve each time. This is the variation in software development. And if we get rid of these peaks, we make $10 an hour. Because software development is now predictable. So understanding the role of variation, which Eric does talk about in his work, understanding that role is very important. I do disagree with the statement that you can control it. But understanding that it's there, and then statistically understanding how that relates to our ability to complete work, this is when we can really do some serious estimates. So how am I doing for time?
You have as much time as you need.
That's the most dangerous thing you could ever say to me. Yes?
Could you give us an estimate?
I can give you something else.
You mentioned that if you have like 1,000 requirements or something like that, to not put them all in the ready.
Right.
Because that'll confuse things. So where do you put them?
So this is with personal Kanban in the personal productivity space, like the current, I don't know, I guess you'd say industry leading practice is GTD. GTD is really awesome for holding that huge backlog of things that you want to do someday or maybe. And we use personal Kanban to do the more of the immediate work adjudication and calming things down. So in the same way, I would still use version 1 or Jira to hold those. Because, I mean, part of the thing is, the Kanban or the personal Kanban is a map of your work. And so, you know, already I've shown you a bunch of different views that you're getting of that. You're seeing how quickly things are done, who's doing what, what's been completed, where things are blocked, and so on and so forth. So if I show you a map of Puget Sound, you know, you see the water, you see the Olympics, you see the Cascades, you see Seattle, you see all the political boundaries, you see where the highways are, and you instantly know that. It seriously takes you less than 5 seconds to know almost everything about the region. If I gave you a long list of all of those features in Jira, you would have no idea how anything related to anything else. So what I like to do is break things into those epics, into those minimal marketable features, and then have Jira hold those. And then when you move them in, you say, like, over the next couple of months, what are the MMFs, what are the that we want to get to? And then you start decomposing as they get closer to reality, to implementation. But, you know, one of the big things about Lean is to do things at the last responsible moment. And that's absolutely something to save for the last responsible moment. So hopefully what's in Jira are these big, huge blocks. And then when you move them out here, then all of a sudden they'll break into a bunch of smaller blocks. Yes?
Where do you keep that? For the whole team to see, or is it just like on a Google Docs spreadsheet?
Okay, so I prefer, if the team is all in one spot, I definitely prefer that you use a physical board, because as messy as this is, that's how messy yours is going to get. But it's going to get that in a good way because you're going to continue to personalize it. And I'll talk a little bit about how that works. There are over 24 online Kanban tools now. The favorites that one of my clients uses is just Google Draw, because they can also customize that. Because one of the things is that when you use a rigid tool, and there's some awesome, you know, rigid tools out there, but when you use them, you can't doodle on them. You can't make them silly. And unfortunately, or fortunately, sometimes we want our work to be kind of silly. So if the team is distributed and you need some sort of electronic board, there are a lot of different options for that. And they can go from something as simple as Trello, which just allows you to put cards up. It doesn't allow you to do WIP limits. Or it can be as something as complicated, or I shouldn't say complicated, but as full-featured as Lean Kit Kanban, which is a pretty phenomenal piece of work. I'm going to cover one thing really quickly, and that's that we like to talk about metrics. Lean Startup loves to talk about metrics. So really quickly, we'll make this a 3. I want to show you my favorite metric, because it's a pretty deep psychological concept. But if you try it, you're going to find out it works. So Let's say that you've pulled this ticket, you're working away on this story or this task or this feature or whatever it happens to be, and you finish it, and you want to remember for your retrospective how it went. You can annotate it with something that looks something like this. Very, very, very complicated stuff here. But what ends up happening is you say, I was really happy when I did this task. This task completely pissed me off. This task, yeah, whatever, it was his task. But if your board starts to fill up with these, very, very quickly you know that the sentiment of your team is going in that direction. This is a leading indicator of every problem that we will face. Team dysfunction, technical debt, delays, whatever you might have. Since we're professionals and we became software developers for a reason, generally the only reason that these things are going to show up is that there's some issue. But when we're just sitting there plugging through work, we tend not to pay attention to when we're upset because we want to get on to the next task. So yes.
So you talked about big things in Jira that they become a bunch of things in the ready state once you're ready to work on them. Does that happen in some sort of planning meeting, or does the big thing go into a work in progress for a little bit and then bounce back? So it obviously depends on the group. So there are groups that have fairly stable and successful product owners. And product owners can do initial decomposition of that if that's a good thing. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. With one of my teams, every Monday morning, they have a 25-minute planning meeting, and they just decompose all of the work for that week. And sometimes that meeting ends in 10 minutes. So, they've scheduled the half hour and they realize that they need like a 5-minute hug. So they just try and do 25 minutes. But one of the things that, that I want to make clear is that, process, there is no single process for developing software, and that what works for your team is what works for your team, because we are all made up of people along that scale, and I've seen teams where people just want to go to work and want to go home and watch TV. I see other teams that go to work and they can't wait to get to the slopes to go snowboarding, right? And they get work done while they're snowboarding. They're still talking about what they're doing as a team. Why would you stop that? At Modus, when we had our offices on Lake Union, we had this beautiful view. Every day we would break at 3 o'clock and we'd do 3 o'clock scotch. And we'd break out a bunch of bottles of scotch. We had whiteboards all over the place, and we'd just think our butts off for the rest of the day. Highly recommended. Now, what did this mean?
This is a time thing where we probably should get to the closure when you want.
Okay. So
bring it to closure.
Okay. Directly goes against your you have as much time as you want.
You said that was dangerous.
So yes. So thank you. That's a good segue. So continuous improvement. We'll close up with that right there in the doing column. Tony Ann and I wrote our book using Google Docs and Skype. She's on one coast and I was on another coast, and we pair wrote pretty much the whole thing. Watching each other type in real time in Google Docs. Over the course of that, we noticed that we were formulating new ways of working together without having discussions. There was emergent systems coming out of how we were working together as a team. When you're in a band and you are playing with your bandmates, you'll be playing and you'll go through chord changes without any communication with anybody else. You just know after playing with those people for a period of time, that's how things work. The more we subscribe ourselves to rigid systems, the less we allow that emergent system to coalesce around us and our teammates. And that's my biggest message for everybody, and it's the biggest message of the book, is there is no right way to do Kanban, and there is no wrong way to do Kanban. And I think that that's important because I've spent the rest of my career trying to figure out what the right way was to do things. I did want to talk a lot more about the whole pivoting and failure and tracking failure and all of that kind of stuff, but we didn't quite get there. But it's still in my head. If you guys want to talk about it afterwards. Can I do it quickly? I don't know. Can I do it quickly? Tony Ann says I can do it quickly. That's right. If I can only...
Don't ask them how many people want to hear you do it quickly.
Okay. How many people want to hear me do that quickly? How many people want me to back up and not talk about any of the shit I talked about before and only talk about that? So, what we want to do, what I love to do, is develop visual systems that allow us to see those pivots, those pivot points, those areas where we can do minor course corrections as quickly as possible and with the least amount of information necessary. So what I don't want is for people to get all caught up in metrics and go out and start measuring everything on Earth and then become completely obsessed with the way that those numbers are working. Because that's not really the way that software development works. I'm giving a talk in a couple of weeks, and it's called We Are Not Engineers. So there is no software engineering. It's an inventive, creative, emotive process. And software people, we have to work with communication, we have to work with mathematics, we have to work with beauty and design. We have to bring together all of these areas, and none of them are manufacturing. None of them are assembly. So when we're going down a path, we've got some plan, some hope, some desire, and we want to start seeing where those pivot points come up. We have to be very, very honest with ourselves that sometimes those pivots will undo a lot of work that we've done. And I guess I have an example with me and Tony Ann for that as well. Tony Ann and I have written a 320-page book called Instant Karma, 10 Principles of Social Media for Business. It's not been published. We are a publisher. We could publish it at any time. But we got almost done with that book, and then all of a sudden the personal Kanban stuff came up, and we pivoted almost immediately and very radically into getting that stuff done. And we had some pretty painful conversations about what it was that we were getting rid of. I also so there's for completely lay audiences, the example that I use is to say, if I put you in your car on I-90 and I said, okay, all right, sit back, sit on your hands, the car is aimed at Idaho, call me when you get to Idaho, and you just push the gas pedal down and you shoot out on I-90 and you can't touch the steering wheel, you're probably not going to do that. Nor are you going to take me up on my offer if I say, okay, well, if that doesn't work for you, how about if you just touch the steering wheel every 20 minutes? So we need to be constantly pivoting. I mean, I've run into teams where they save all of these things for the retrospective, or they have a specific pivot meeting, and they'll do this like once a month. And part of the reason for that is that they think that there needs to be a lot of conversation and thought behind it. But you get to the end of 2 or 3 days, and everybody's tickets are coming up like this. You better not be waiting until your retrospective to have a conversation about it. Because this is money. This makes you money, this loses money. Mad programmers will cost you more money than any other thing in the world. No, those are crazy programmers. So there are two other cards over here. One is see the problems, and the other one is provide slack. Getting things done quickly is not a business model. What we want to do is do thoughtful things, do the correct things, and when things are complete, then we're happy because they were the correct things to do. I've seen, we want to talk about anti-patterns with Kanban. I've seen plenty of teams like not have any meetings, not talk to each other anymore because the game becomes moving the tickets as fast as they possibly can. I've seen that several times. People will break any system, that you set up for them. But when you start to set up a system where they're actively seeing the problems, so they would do things like the feature ticket would go over and then they'd throw it away, and then they wouldn't treat the bug ticket as part of the feature. So the bug was just like new work. So it wasn't like anything ever really came back. Incredibly twisted view of the world. I've talked to teams where I say, what is your defect rate? And they can't tell me. And they'll say, we don't have a defect rate. It's like, awesome. So we want our teams to be introspective, and in order to be introspective, again, we need to see our stuff. We need to be doing the amount of stuff that we can handle so we're not overloaded. When Tony and I work with teams, and we'll say, okay, today we're going through this class thing, but starting tomorrow, 7:30 in the morning, we'll have coffee and donuts, and we're going to do a lean coffee. Everybody laughs. Like, we're not coming in at 7:30 in the morning. But by the second day, we'll have 20, 30 people every single time, regardless of the company. Because most people are so busy, they don't have time to talk about work. So how can you pivot if you don't even have time to talk about your work? So we need to actually build Slack into our systems, and that's going to be independent to the teams. Like I said, some teams, it might be, we're going to, you pull 3 cards of work and then you pull a card of research or reading. You pull 3 cards of work and you pick a card of drinking scotch. We pull 3 cards of work and then you can go snowboarding. But give people and give their brains time to actually process what they've done. One of the techniques that we use is called the Pomodoro technique. Does anybody know what that is? Just a couple. So Pomodoro it's also a ridiculously simple thing. You work for 25 minutes and then you don't work for 5 minutes. And when you're not working for 5 minutes, no, I really mean it, don't work for those 5 minutes. It's not like you're working for 25 minutes and then you can answer your email. So you take one thing, you focus on it for those 25 minutes, and then for the 5 minutes, you go take a walk. And part of that is, we didn't evolve as a species, we didn't evolve sitting in cubes. We weren't sitting there, saying, it's time to go hunt and gather, so let's all get out of our cubes and go. It was, we were basically meant for learning things while running around. So we would learn things like, I'm walking over here and there are berries, or I'm walking over here and there's a saber-toothed tiger, and holy shit, I'm running. And I'm really going to remember that now, because the movement of my body is imprinting on my brain the urgency of running into the saber-toothed tiger. So, how many of you guys have ever had to fill out a timesheet? And how many of you guys have gotten to the point of filling out your timesheet and said, I don't remember what the hell I did this week?
Did you ask to make up numbers?
Yeah. and so the thing is that was 40 hours of our lives, right? I mean, that's what we're living during that time. It's like, we've just flushed all that time away. And the reason is exactly what the Zeigarnik effect said. We were done with that thing, so we forgot it because we were moving on to the next thing. We can't find pivot points if we don't remember what we just did. I think that logic is unassailable. So when you have a system that will remind you what you did, remind you how you felt about it, remind you who you worked on it with, that is going to give you the real information that you need to see the trajectory of your project. Providing the slack time, it's, Google has their 20%, lots of companies have different ways of doing this, but giving people the ability to A, process what they're doing, and then B, be expansive and explorative. I don't think there's anybody in this room that would argue with that, but I do think that as people, once we sit down and we get in the zone, whatever that zone might be, we don't come out for a long time, right? I'm sure that we've all, Tony Anwell and I are, we're humans, right? So when we were writing the book, there were days where I would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which was 8 o'clock in the morning for her. We would start writing, and then at about, 8 or 9 p.m., I would say something like, Tony Ann, isn't it like midnight for you? And she's like, yes, but I can't stop. So getting in the zone feels great, and it's what we want. But when we do that, we end up burning ourselves out. And what ended up happening was a lot of that zone writing that we did. Oh, this is another thing to talk about. We ended up, if not tossing out, radically altering by the time it was complete. And I can go back to this sunk cost fallacy. And this was like almost every day when we got into the editing phase. We would have a block of text, and Tony Ann's like, this block of text isn't working for me. And we'd pound on it for hours. And then finally I would highlight it and I would delete it. And everything would read better. But we couldn't get rid of it because we'd sunk our time into it. And because we were like in love with like 2 sentences in the paragraph. But the paragraph didn't add to the product. So if we would have left all those paragraphs in that book would be like, infinite jest. It would be just utterly gigantic. So, I'll try and come up with 2 pithy sentences to close this. We have, there's an old Pogo quote, which is, we have met the enemy and he is us. And that is absolutely true for us as people who are starting ventures. We are our own worst enemies. And we are fraught with our own biases. And our biases do crazy things for us. Because we can sit there and say, I'm doing this because it's pragmatic. But all of those pragmatic things that we're setting up are suffering from what's called experimenter's bias, or confirmation bias, which is we will set up experiments that prove the thing that we want them to prove. So if I want to prove that people fall over, I can run out there and start pushing you guys over, and I'll say, people fall over all the time. My experiment says so. So we have to recognize that when we're setting up like A/B tests, and we think that we're getting back independent data because we're not actually clicking, that may not be valid. When we are setting up A/B tests and we're not actually saying, is the product something that people want? We may not be gathering the right information. And Daniel Kahneman, who's kind of like the king of cognitive bias, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, which I recommend to absolutely everybody on the planet, one of the things he says in it is, there is no way to inoculate yourself from these cognitive biases. So he's been studying them for 50 years, and he absolutely is as subjected to them as anybody else. So what I try and do to show those pivot points, to free ourselves from those biases, is keep things visual and constantly be changing the methods of my visualization in case the visualization is suffering from those same biases. That's pretty long and convoluted, but
Could you tell people how you can, they can follow up on the personal Kanban and the cognitive biases and kind of what's next as a closing?
Well, the easiest way is that you could walk over here and buy the book, which is $5 less from me than it is from Amazon. And that $5 will pay you back for coming here tonight. How's that? It's a rebate. We wrote a mini book, which is a Kindle-only thing, which is $2.99, about cognitive bias in business. It's on Amazon, and we also have little cards over here if you want to go check that out. The other thing that I would recommend is again, Wednesdays at 8:30 is Lean Coffee. One thing I will say about Lean Coffee is my friend Jeremy Lightsmith and I set it up 2 years ago, and the system is so self-perpetuating that we don't have to show up anymore. So we've built a very sizable community of practice around lean software engineering in Seattle without having a board of directors, without having to have a location, without, just basically just people coming to have coffee and talking about what's important to them. And yeah, those would probably be the best ways. Oh, and then in the summer, two more. In the summer, we're going to have a lean camp, which may be called something slightly different, but we had it last year at the Center for Urban Horticulture. And last year it went really, really well. And what I really appreciated about last year were two things. One, gender parity, and two, only 50% of the people were from software. Yes. Oh, and then we had awesome food trucks too, and we do our best to keep it incredibly reasonably priced. Then the last thing is the Lean SSC, the Lean Software and Systems Consortium. We are having our annual conference in Boston. Very pretty place, and amazing speakers. So if you just Google LSSC. It would be great if you guys could come to that. It's certainly a bigger operation than just me, because I'm doing hardly anything for it except maybe talking about it. Although you can come take a cooking class from me, because I'm doing lean cooking. In the Action Kitchen, yes, which I did not name. So that's it. We'll be wandering around here for a while if you guys have other questions or what have you.
All right, thank you.